Comrades, let us cast aside the illusions with which the ruling class poisons our minds. Look around you. The headlines scream of individual failings, the courts condemn, isolate actors, and the moralistic pundits pontificate about personal responsibility. Yet what is obscured by this theatrical display of blame is the truth that is written not in the stars but in the cold, hard architecture of our society itself. It is the system, the machine of capitalism, that commits these crimes. It is the system that exploits, alienates, and oppresses. And it is the system that now demands of you silence and submission. Society, in its dominant narrative, casts guilt upon individuals as though human failures are born in isolation. But we must not be deceived. The so-called failings of one are the inevitable consequences of a structure designed to concentrate wealth, power, and opportunity in the hands of a few, while millions toil, starve, and struggle to survive. The banker who precipitates economic collapse is lauded with bailouts and golden parachutes. The worker who loses her home, her livelihood, or her dignity is labelled irresponsible. Who then commits crime? Is it the homeless mother stealing bread, or the corporations stealing the sweat, labour, and lives of millions? The system manufactures criminals, then condemns them to conceal its own guilt. Capitalism, my friends, is not a neutral arbiter. It is a violent, exploitative apparatus that thrives on inequality. As I have written, the worker is alienated from the fruits of her labour, separated from her creative power, and rendered powerless against the forces that govern her life. The capitalist expropriates the surplus of labour, turning human effort into profit, and the law, the media, and the culture itself are deployed to shield the exploiters from accountability. Individual blame is the opiate used to keep the masses passive, to deflect attention from the structural crimes that saturate our economy, our politics, and our very institutions. Do not be seduced by the myth of meritocracy. The system rewards obedience, submission, and conformity, and punishes those who dare question the social order. It is not individual weakness nor moral deficiency, but systemic design that creates poverty, crime, and despair. The society that accuses individuals of failure is the very society that hoards wealth, denies opportunity, and criminalizes survival. Look closely. The laws that punish theft protect property, not life. The regulations that penalize dissent preserve hierarchy, not justice. We are witnessing a world where inequality is normalized, where structural violence masquerades as personal misfortune, and where collective oppression is hidden behind the guise of moralistic judgment. But this veil can be torn asunder. The working class, united by our shared condition, possesses the collective power to confront, challenge, and overthrow the structures that perpetuate injustice. The proletariat is not a collection of isolated failures. We are a force capable of systemic transformation. Only through solidarity, through organization, through the reclaiming of the means of production, can we uproot the mechanisms that criminalize survival and criminalize humanity itself. History teaches us that no oppression is eternal. Every epoch dominated by systemic injustice is also an epoch pregnant with resistance. When the workers awaken to their exploitation, when the oppressed recognize the artifice of individual blame, when the masses refuse to accept a narrative crafted by the few for the enrichment of the few, the foundations of tyranny begin to tremble. The crimes of the system, economic plunder, social inequality, ecological devastation cannot be undone by castigating the powerless. They can only be eradicated by dismantling the system itself. We must see clearly that individual guilt is the smoke and systemic crime is the fire. We must confront the architects of this society, the financiers, the industrialists, the politicians, and the media moguls who profit from oppression. And we must rise not as isolated victims, but as a united class, as comrades, bound by shared struggle, bound by the promise of liberation. Let us reject the lie that individuals alone bear responsibility for society's ills. Let us expose the system that produces suffering as a deliberate, calculable act. Let us organize, mobilize, and reclaim the wealth, labor, and dignity that are rightfully ours. And let history record that we did not accept blame where it was not due, that we did not bow to injustice, and that we did not cower in the face of systemic crime. The time for awakening is now. The time for unity is now. The time to strike at the heart of systemic oppression is now. Comrades, rise, organize, and demand a society where justice is structural, accountability is systemic, and humanity is supreme over profit. Society's insistence on blaming individuals for the consequences of systemic failures is neither accidental nor benign. It is a deliberate mechanism designed to protect the interests of the ruling class and to obscure the structural violence embedded within capitalist society. When a corporation collapses due to reckless speculation, when a financial crisis impoverishes millions, or when a public service fails under the weight of underfunding, the narrative is almost always shifted toward individual culpability. A single executive is labeled greedy or incompetent, a lone employee is castigated for errors, or a single citizen is criminalized for acting in desperation. Yet the truth is that these crises are not isolated incidents produced by random failing or individual malice. They are predictable outcomes of a system organized to concentrate wealth, power, and decision-making in the hands of a few, while leaving the vast majority vulnerable to exploitation and marginalization. The machinery of capitalism functions in such a way that inequality is structural, not incidental. It is an architecture designed to ensure that those who hold economic power remain insulated from the consequences of their actions, while those who labor under its weight are blamed, punished, and made to bear the burden of systemic collapse. This diversion of blame serves multiple functions simultaneously. It shields the system from scrutiny, it prevents the oppressed from recognizing the true sources of their suffering, and it justifies further control, surveillance, and punishment of the powerless. In casting the individual as the locus of blame, society constructs a moral narrative that suggests personal failings are the root cause of social dysfunction, thereby masking the deliberate mechanisms of exploitation and oppression embedded in every institution, from corporate boards to governmental agencies, from law enforcement to media conglomerates. The legal system, far from being neutral, reinforces this paradigm. Laws are written to protect property and capital rather than human life and dignity, create a framework where systemic harms, such as environmental destruction, wage theft, unsafe working conditions, and predatory lending are normalized, while the victims of these harms are criminalized when they attempt to resist, survive, or even protest. Media narratives amplify this effect, sensationalizing stories of individual wrongdoing while glossing over the structural factors that produce them. The framing of crime, failure, or misfortune as personal moral deficiency obscures the role of the system that shapes opportunities, constrains choices, and enforces economic hierarchies. Education and culture also participate in this deception. From an early age, individuals are taught to internalize the language of personal responsibility, to believe that success is purely the product of effort and talent, and that failure is a reflection of moral or intellectual weakness. This ideological conditioning serves the ruling class by creating a compliant workforce that seeks to adapt to exploitation rather than challenge it. People are led to compete against one another for scarce rewards, turning their attention inward rather than toward the structural conditions that limit them. In this way, the system not only perpetuates economic inequality but also fractures the potential for collective awareness and solidarity. The narrative of individual blame is particularly insidious because it exploits deeply ingrained moral and psychological tendencies. Humans are predisposed to attribute causality to identifiable agents. It is easier to scorn a single person than to confront the abstract, diffuse mechanisms of structural oppression. Capitalism leverages this tendency by presenting complex social phenomena as matters of personal failure or virtue. Poverty, addiction, unemployment, and crime are thus transformed into moral indictments of the individual, experiencing them, rather than reflections of the inequities that shape their lives. In reality, systemic crimes, economic collapse, environmental degradation, exploitation of labor, displacement of communities, denial of healthcare, and political corruption are the predictable outcomes of policies and practice designed to maximize profit at the expense of human well-being. To recognize the culpability of the system is not merely to understand causation, it is to confront the ideological apparatus that deflects attention from structural injustice. The ruling class benefits enormously from this diversion of attention. By ensuring that individuals are blamed, punished, and shamed, they protect the institutions and practices that generate wealth and power for themselves. They maintain control over resources, prevent the formation of organized resistance, and legitimize social hierarchies as natural or deserved. Without such a mechanism of blame, the logic of exploitation becomes transparent, revealing the stark reality that systemic harms are neither accidental nor inevitable but deliberate and preventable if the oppressed were to unite and demand structural change. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for any meaningful effort toward justice. Awareness of the system's culpability exposes the hypocrisy of moralistic condemnations of individual actors while enabling the oppressed to identify the true architects of social harm. Recognizing that structural conditions create crises allows for the development of collective strategies for resistance and reform, transforming passive suffering into organized struggle. By dismantling the illusion that individual failings are the root cause of societal harm, the working class and marginalized population can reclaim the narrative, assert their rights, and challenge the systemic forces that perpetuate exploitation and inequality. The concealment of systemic crime behind individual blame is, therefore, not merely a misrepresentation of reality, it is a foundational tactic of social control, a method of preserving the privileges of the ruling class, and a barrier to liberation that must be unmasked if society is to move toward justice, equality, and human dignity. Capitalism is not merely an economic system. It is a social architecture designed to concentrate power, wealth, and opportunity in the hands of a small minority while systematically impoverishing, marginalizing, and alienating the majority. Its mechanisms are deliberate, and its effects are predictable, yet society persistently obscures these realities behind myths of personal failure and meritocratic justice. In this system, inequality is not an unfortunate byproduct, it is the very foundation upon which the entire edifice rests. Wealth and resources accumulate at the top, extracted from the labor of the many, while the working class is compelled to subsist on wages that barely cover the necessities of life. The capitalist class profits not merely by producing goods or services, but by appropriating the surplus labor of the working class, the difference between the value produced by workers and the wages they receive. This structural extraction is the engine of inequality, producing a small elite of owners, investors, and financiers whose power grows exponentially as they monopolize wealth, while the vast majority remain ensnared in cycles of debt, precarity, and insecurity. Exploitation is not incidental in capitalism, it is its defining principle. The worker is compelled to sell her labor to survive, yet she is denied full access to the fruits of her creativity, energy, and effort. Every hour worked enriches the employer far more than it enriches the laborer, and every success of capital is built upon labor that is underpaid, overextended, and undervalued. The system masks this exploitation by promoting ideologies of personal responsibility and ambition, convincing workers that their struggles are due to lack of effort or talent rather than systemic design. Alienation is the psychological and social counterpart to economic exploitation. Workers are estranged from the products of their labor, unable to see themselves reflected in the things they create, and yet required to invest their time, skills, and energy into producing wealth that serves another's interests. Their work becomes a commodity, their creativity a tool for profit, and their humanity subordinated to the imperatives of production and consumption. In this environment, social relationships are mediated by competition and exchange, and the worker becomes isolated, disconnected from peers, and estranged from the community, the world, and even from themselves. Alienation, exploitation, and inequality are inseparable aspects of the capitalist structure. They reinforce each other in a self-perpetuating cycle. When a worker fails to achieve social or economic mobility, when a student cannot afford higher education, when a family is evicted from their home, these are not random misfortunes, but inevitable consequences of a system that allocates opportunity and resources according to ownership and power rather than need or merit. Society, however, seeks to obscure these structural realities by attributing failure to personal deficiency, laziness, or poor judgment. The narrative of individual failure is a deliberate ideological construction designed to justify the system and prevent collective awareness. The poor are blamed for poverty, the unemployed for joblessness, the sick for illness, and the marginalized for social exclusion, while the structures that produce and sustain these conditions remain unexamined and unchallenged. This misdirection not only preserves the power of the elite, but also fosters division among the oppressed, preventing solidarity and collective action. The inevitability of failure under capitalism is further magnified by the way the system organizes scarcity and competition. Education, healthcare, housing, and basic necessities are commodified, forcing individuals to compete for access to resources essential for survival and advancement. The pressures of this competition exacerbate inequality, as those born into privilege are more likely to succeed, while those born into disadvantage face structural barriers that limit opportunity, regardless of talent or effort. The system is designed so that success is rare and often illusory, and failure is statistically predetermined for the majority. Furthermore, capitalism thrives on the illusion of choice and mobility. It presents opportunities as available to all, suggesting that anyone can ascend through hard work or ingenuity, yet the structural conditions ensure that only a few can attain wealth and security. For the majority, these promises are unattainable, and the gap between aspiration and reality produces not only economic hardship but also psychological stress, feelings of inadequacy, and social alienation. The capitalist system ensures that the consequences of structural inequality, poverty, crime, social marginalization, and disenfranchisement appear as personal failings rather than systemic outcomes. By framing failure as the result of individual deficiency, the system diverts attention from the structural forces that make such failure inevitable, and it preserves the legitimacy of the ruling class while discouraging organized resistance. Understanding capitalism as a structure that inherently produces inequality, exploitation, and alienation is essential for recognizing the limits of personal responsibility and the necessity of collective struggle. It reveals that individual failure is not an aberration, but a predictable outcome of systemic oppression. To challenge this reality, it is not enough to advise personal improvement or resilience. It is necessary to confront the structural conditions that produce inequality, to unite with fellow workers, and to organize for systemic transformation, reclaiming control over labor, wealth, and the social mechanisms that shape human life. The myth of meritocracy and the ideology of personal responsibility are among the most insidious tools employed by capitalist society to maintain control over the working class and to obscure the structural inequalities that govern every aspect of life. From the moment of birth, individuals are socialized to believe that their success or failure is entirely the result of their own talent, intelligence, effort, or moral character. Schools teach that grades, accolades, and achievements are reflections of personal merit. Employers propagate the idea that promotions, bonuses, and career advancement are earned solely through diligence and skill. Media and culture reinforce the narrative that those who rise are deserving, and those who fail are deficient, lazy, or morally flawed. On the surface, meritocracy appears fair, rewarding those who work hardest and possess the greatest ability. But this is a deception carefully constructed to conceal the structural mechanisms of inequality and to justify the privileges of the ruling class. In reality, meritocracy does not exist as a neutral system of reward. It functions as a veil that masks the exploitation, oppression, and unequal distribution of resources inherent to capitalism. Wealth, opportunity, and social status are not distributed based on ability or effort, but on inherent advantage, access to education, networks, influence, and the systemic control of capital. The individual who is celebrated as successful often benefits from these pre-existing conditions, while the worker who struggles is constrained by structural barriers that limit their choices, suppress their potential, and make failure statistically predictable. By promoting the idea that failure is personal rather than systemic, meritocracy directs attention away from the economic and social structures that produce inequality. It transforms what is a collective problem, the design of a society where wealth and power are concentrated, into a series of individual moral failings. Poverty is treated as laziness, unemployment as incompetence, and social marginalization as a consequence of personal decisions, rather than the predictable outcomes of a system that commodifies labor, hoards resources, and prioritizes profit over human need. Personal responsibility, when divorced from the context of systemic constraints, becomes a moral weapon wielded against the oppressed. It shames those who cannot meet impossible standards imposed by society, presenting structural barriers as evidence of individual inadequacy. Those who question this narrative are labeled excuses makers or failures, while those who comply are rewarded with minimal sustenance, temporary comfort, or social approval, giving the illusion of fairness while perpetuating exploitation. The function of this ideology is not only to legitimize inequality, but also to prevent collective awareness and resistance. When individuals believe that their struggles are solely the result of personal shortcomings, they are less likely to organize, to unite with others in similar positions, or to challenge the systems that oppress them. The myth of meritocracy fractures the working class, creating competition among individuals for limited resources and opportunities rather than fostering solidarity against the structures that produce scarcity. Moreover, meritocracy obscures the role of inherited privilege and systemic advantage. Those born into wealth, access, and influence are celebrated as talented or hardworking, while the advantages conferred by their social position are ignored. In this way, the ideology of meritocracy naturalizes inequality, presenting the social hierarchy as just, inevitable, and deserved, while disguising the deliberate mechanisms through which the ruling class preserves power. It is a powerful tool of social control, shaping consciousness, guiding behavior, and reinforcing compliance. By convincing the oppressed that their fate is a reflection of personal failure, the system diverts attention from its own culpability and prevents organized resistance that could challenge the structures of exploitation. Education, media, and culture all participate in this deception, creating a society in which people internalize oppression, blaming themselves for conditions that are external and imposed. The worker is told that she must simply work harder. The student is told that she must simply study more. The poor are told that they must simply budget better. And the marginalized are told that they must simply conform, adapt, or strive more diligently to succeed in a system that is structurally designed to favor the few. Recognizing the myth of meritocracy as a tool of oppression is a crucial step toward collective consciousness and revolutionary action. It reveals that personal failure is often the predictable result of systemic inequality rather than individual deficiency. To dismantle the mechanisms of exploitation, it is necessary to reject the ideology of meritocracy, expose the structural forces that govern life, and unite in collective struggle to redistribute power, reclaim the means of production, and create a society where human potential is determined, not by inherited advantage or structural barriers, but by genuine freedom, opportunity, and shared prosperity. True justice cannot exist in a society structured to privilege a few at the expense of the many. Justice is not merely a matter of enforcing laws or punishing individual wrongdoing. It is a reflection of the fairness, equality, and balance embedded within social, economic, and political systems. Under capitalism, what passes for justice is a veneer designed to preserve hierarchy, protect the property of the wealthy, and conceal the exploitation of the working class. Courts defend property more rigorously than human life. Legislation enshrines the power of corporations, while marginalizing communities, and media narratives frame systemic oppression as individual failure. In such a society, appeals to personal morality, conscience, or fairness are insufficient, for the very institutions that adjudicate justice are themselves instruments of inequality. True justice requires a profound collective awareness, a consciousness among the oppressed that their suffering is neither accidental nor personal, but the inevitable outcome of systemic exploitation. Individuals alone cannot dismantle the structures that shape their lives, for the forces arrayed against them, capital, state power, ideology, and culture, operate collectively and are interwoven into the fabric of society. It is only when people recognize the shared nature of their oppression that they can begin to organize, to unite in solidarity, and to act with purpose towards systemic transformation. Solidarity is the lifeblood of genuine justice. The working class, when fragmented and isolated, is vulnerable to manipulation, competition, and internalized blame. When workers, the unemployed, the marginalized, and the oppressed recognize that their struggles are interconnected, that their exploitation is a collective experience orchestrated by the few, they acquire the power to resist, to negotiate, and to transform society. Solidarity transforms individual grievances into collective action, enabling the oppressed to challenge not merely symptoms but the root causes of injustice. Justice, in this sense, is inseparable from the redistribution of power. It requires the dismantling of exploitative systems that concentrate wealth, monopolize decision-making, and subjugate labor. It demands that the means of production, the instruments through which human labor is converted into wealth, be reclaimed by the majority rather than hoarded by a privileged minority. Without such structural change, legal, political, or social reforms are superficial, providing temporary relief or symbolic victories while leaving the foundations of inequality intact. Collective awareness and solidarity also entail the recognition of the mechanisms through which ideology perpetuates oppression. Education, media, religion, and cultural norms all serve to naturalize inequality, present hierarchical structures as inevitable, meritocratic, or morally justified. To achieve true justice, the oppressed must expose these ideological constructions, understand the systemic nature of their exploitation, and reject narratives that divide, shame, or mislead. Justice is not passive, it is active, requiring struggle, courage, and persistence. It is realized through organized resistance, through the construction of alternative social, economic, and political arrangements that prioritize human need over profit, cooperation over competition, and equality over hierarchy. History demonstrates that transformative justice is never granted voluntarily by those in power. It must be seized collectively by those whose labor sustains society, yet whose lives are marginalized. The overthrow of exploitative systems is therefore a moral and practical imperative. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, maintained through coercion, ideology, and legal enforcement, perpetuates cycles of poverty, environmental degradation, and social instability. To address these injustices requires not reform within the existing framework, but a radical restructuring of the framework itself. This is not merely a political question, it is an ethical one. True justice cannot coexist with exploitation, alienation, or structural inequality. It is inseparable from freedom, the capacity of individuals and communities to shape their own lives, to benefit from the fruits of their labor, and to participate fully in decisions that affect their existence. Collective awareness, solidarity, and systemic transformation are therefore prerequisites for a just society, for without these, justice remains an abstraction, a promise unfulfilled, a tool wielded to legitimate oppression rather than to rectify it. To achieve true justice, the oppressed must see clearly the interconnectedness of their struggles, understand the structures that perpetuate inequality, and act together to dismantle those structures. Only through the unity of those who labor, suffer, and resist can justice be made tangible, real, and enduring. Only through collective struggle can the machinery of exploitation be dismantled, wealth and power be redistributed, and society be remade to serve the many rather than the few. Justice demands organization, consciousness, and unwavering commitment to overturn the systems that deny it, for without these, oppression will continue to be naturalized, inequality will continue to be justified, and human potential will continue to be suppressed. Under the weight of structural domination, the working class is not a passive collection of individuals bound by circumstance. It is a potent force whose collective labor sustains society and whose unity possesses the capacity to overturn systems of exploitation and reclaim what is rightfully theirs. For too long, the ruling class has profited from the sweat, toil, and creativity of workers, appropriating the surplus of labor to accumulate wealth, secure privilege, and entrench social hierarchy. Yet this extraction is only possible because the working class has been fragmented, divided by ideology, competition, and false narratives of personal failure. The moment workers recognize their shared condition, the illusion of power held by the elite begins to crumble. Organization is the key to this transformation, for it converts isolated suffering into collective strength, individual frustration into coordinated action, and private grievances into public struggle. Through unions, worker councils, cooperative movements, and social alliances, the laboring majority can articulate demands, enforce rights, and resist the mechanisms of exploitation that have historically constrained them. Every strike, every protest, every act of mutual aid demonstrates the capacity of the working class to assert its agency against systems designed to suppress it. Resistance is both a practical and moral imperative, for it challenges the legitimacy of structures that profit from oppression and forces recognition of the humanity and dignity of those who labor. The reclamation of labor begins with the understanding that the products of work, the creativity of human effort, and the value generated by collective action belong to those who produce them, not to distant owners who exploit them for private gain. When workers organize to assert control over production, to demand fair wages, safe conditions, and equitable treatment, they begin to invert the logic of exploitation and assert the principle that labor is a source of empowerment rather than subjugation. Wealth, which has been concentrated in the hands of a few through systematic extraction of labor, can be reclaimed through collective struggle and structural change. Redistribution is not merely a moral demand, it is an economic and social necessity. The accumulation of wealth by the elite occurs at the expense of the majority, creating conditions of scarcity, insecurity, and deprivation. By uniting, the working class can challenge monopolies, enforce labor rights, and build institutions that prioritize social need over private profit, thereby reclaiming resources that are essential for human flourishing. Dignity, often stripped away under systems that treat laborers as interchangeable commodities, is restored through solidarity and collective assertion of rights. To reclaim dignity is to demand recognition of humanity, to insist that work be valued, conditions be humane, and voices be heard. Every act of organization, every display of resistance, and every expression of collective will reinforce the self-worth of those who have been told they are powerless, marginalized, or disposable. History offers countless examples of the transformative power of organized labor and popular resistance. Revolutions, labor movements, and social uprisings demonstrate that when the working class unite, it can reshape economies, challenge entrenched hierarchies, and redefine the rules of society. These victories are not merely symbolic. They create tangible improvements in wages, working conditions, access to education, healthcare, and political representation. They reveal the capacity of ordinary people to wield extraordinary power when their efforts are coordinated and their consciousness awakened to the structural nature of their oppression. Education and awareness are vital components of this struggle. The working class must understand the mechanisms of exploitation, the ways in which ideology, law, and culture serve the interests of the elite, and the historical patterns through which resistance has achieved gains. Knowledge transforms despair into strategy, helplessness into initiative, and awareness into a roadmap for collective action. Every step taken toward organization and resistance strengthens the capacity of workers to negotiate power, confront injustice, and reclaim what has been stolen by systemic exploitation. Reclaiming labor, wealth, and dignity is not an abstract aspiration. It is a concrete project of social transformation that requires courage, persistence, and unity. The forces arrayed against the working-class corporations, political elites, media apparatuses, and legal institutions are formidable, but they are not invincible. Their power depends upon the compliance and fragmentation of the majority. When workers recognize their common interest, act in concert, and refuse to accept the dictate of the few, the balance of power shifts, and the structures of oppression can be dismantled. Every act of collective organization, whether large or small, contributes to this shift. Mutual aid networks, cooperative enterprises, labor strikes, political campaigns, and community assemblies are expressions of the latent power inherent in the working class. Resistance transforms despair into hope, exploitation into empowerment, and subjugation into liberation. Ultimately, the reclamation of labor, wealth, and dignity through organization. And resistance is both an assertion of rights and a declaration of humanity. It affirms that workers are not disposable cogs in a machine of profit, but the foundation of society itself, whose power, when united, can reshape the world to reflect justice, equality, and human flourishing. Comrades, the truths we have laid bare today demand no compromise and no delay. Society's insistence on blaming individuals for systemic crimes, the structural inequalities embedded in capitalism, the illusion of meritocracy, the necessity of collective awareness, and the power of organized resistance all converge to reveal a singular reality. Oppression is deliberate, inequality is manufactured, and liberation is only possible through unity and struggle. The ruling class seeks to divide, distract, and demoralize us, but in recognizing our shared condition, in understanding the machinery of exploitation, and in asserting our collective strength, we reclaim not only our labor, wealth, and dignity, but the very possibility of a just society. Justice is not granted, it is seized. Freedom is not given, it is fought for. And the future belongs to those who organize, who resist, and who refuse to accept a world where the many exist for the enrichment of the few. Rise, comrades, and let history witness that the working class did not bow, did not submit, and did not accept blame where it was not due. Stand together, act together, and forge a society in which humanity triumphs, over profit, solidarity over division, and justice over exploitation.